Good evening. I'm Haylee Ficuciello, Senior Correspondent for Englebrook Independent News. Tonight, we take you across the Great Plains and deep into federal court systems where prosecutors are targeting violent offenders, cartel-linked drug traffickers, child exploitation suspects, immigration offenders, fraud operations, gang-connected smugglers, and convicted felons accused of illegally possessing firearms. From Montana to Texas, from Oklahoma to Louisiana, federal authorities say these are confronting growing waves of organized criminal activity stretching across state lines and international borders. Among tonight's cases, a Texas man sentenced in a disturbing illegal trafficking conspiracy tied to illegal killing of thousands of birds. Massive fentanyl and methamphetamine trafficking operation dismantled across Wyoming and South Dakota. Human smuggling organization operating near the southern border. Child sexual exploitation investigation spanning multiple states. A multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme that devastated dozens of victims, violent armed robberies across Colorado, federal fraud cases involving counterfeit currency, PPP loan schemes, healthcare fraud, and bank fraud conspiracies. This is your Englebrook Independent News Federal Crime Report. Let's begin tonight in Montana. Federal prosecutors in Montana say a Texas man who purchased illegally killed bald and golden eagles on a black market has now been sentenced in a sprawling wildlife trafficking conspiracy that authorities say resulted in deaths of approximately 3,600 birds. 71-year-old John Patrick Butler of Humble, Texas, was sentenced in Minnesota federal court to 5 years probation and ordered to pay $77,000 in restitution. According to prosecutors, Butler pled guilty to conspiracy, unlawful trafficking of bald and golden eagles, and purchased eagle killed illegal in violation of the Lacey Act. Investigators uncovered text messages allegedly sent between Butler and co-defendant Travis John Branson discussing the killing and sales of eagles. Authorities say Butler specifically requested certain eagle parts, particularly tail feathers, and used PayPal and other online payment services to purchase them. Federal prosecutors allege the birds were illegally hunted and killed on the Flathead Indian Reservation and elsewhere before being shipped throughout the United States Postal Service from Montana to Texas. Court records detailed multiple transactions between 2020 and early of 2021, including purchase of golden eagle tails and tail feathers set costing hundreds of dollars in each. The investigation exposed what prosecutors describe as a nationwide black market wildlife trafficking network. In Great Falls, a Mexican national has been sentenced after federal authorities say he purchased fraudulent immigration documents and admitted to entering the United States illegally. 33-year-old Salvador Santiago Lopez received a sentence of time served, 62 days, before being remanded to the U.S. Border Patrol custody. Authorities say Santiago Lopez was stopped near Malta, Montana in March. During question, investigators say he admitted he entered the country illegally in 2017 and posed fake identification documents, including a counterfeit Social Security card and fake permanent resident card. Federal prosecutors also say Santiago Lopez admitted he planned to borrow money to help finance the smuggling of his sister into the United States. Investigators discovered approximately $18,000 in cash during the traffic stop. A Billings man has been sentenced to 18 months in federal prison after prosecutors say he illegally possessed a firearm during a road rage incident. 41-year-old Matthew David Slemmer pled guilty to being a prohibited person in possession of a firearm. Authorities say a 911 call reported Slemmer pulled a gun during a confrontation in a traffic before driving into a parking lot. Police later recovered a high-point 9mm pistol from Slemmer's vehicle. Federal prosecutors noted that Slemmer was already prohibited from possessing a firearm due to a permanent protection order connected to a prior domestic violence allegation. Federal prosecutors in Wyoming announced the sentencing of a Cayenne man in a child exploitation investigation tied to National Center of Missing and Exploited Children. 33-year-old L.V. Charles Snickney was sentenced to 87 months in federal prison, followed by 10 years of supervised release. Investigators say Kick messaging platform reports led authorities to suspect child sexual abuse materials linked to Snickney. Search warrants executed on electric devices allegedly uncovered multiple videos and images depicting child sexual abuse material. Snickney was also ordered to pay $42,000 in restitution to the victims. Federal court across Wyoming also handed down several major narcotic trafficking sentencing involving methamphetamine and fentanyl. 65-year-old Timothy Lee Cook of Phoenix received 78 months in prison after authorities linked him to a methamphetamine and fentanyl shipment sent to the United States Postal Office. Investigators conducted controlled buy, controlling hundreds of grams of narcotics. Meanwhile, 66-year-old Brent Hutskin of Gillette was sentenced to 71 months after authorities seized approximately 2 kilos or 4.4 pounds of methamphetamine during a traffic stop. In another case, 35-year-old Nicholas Rinson of Cheyenne received 140 months in federal prison after investigators discovered fentanyl and methamphetamine distribution tied to his residence. Authorities recovered more than 400 grams of methamphetamine and more than 100 grams of fentanyl. And in Lander, 33-year-old Ismail Escalama was sentenced to 4 years in prison after authorities located fentanyl tablets, methamphetamine, fentanyl powder, and drug distribution material during a vehicle investigation. In South Dakota, a Sussex Falls man has been sentenced to 21 months in federal prison for illegally possessing a firearm while already on probation due to prior felony convictions. 25-year-old Omet Musa Kolaro fled from the vehicle during a police pursuit in August of 2024 before allegedly throwing away a firearm while running from the officers. Federal prosecutors say Carlo was already on supervised release for another federal conviction at the same time of the offense. Federal prosecutors in South Dakota also announced multiple major narcotic trafficking sentencing connected to cocaine, fentanyl, and methamphetamine conspiracies. 35-year-old Chase May of Madison received 5 years in federal prison after investigators uncovered cocaine trafficking operations involving controlled purchases and interstate narcotic transportation. Authorities seized cocaine, marijuana, firearms, and cash during the investigation. In one of the most region's largest narcotic case, 48-year-old Matthew Shades of T, South Dakota was sentenced to 21 years and 6 months in prison. Federal investigators say Shades led a trafficking organization responsible for moving approximately 200 pounds of methamphetamine and large quantities of fentanyl from Arizona to South Dakota. Authorities intercepted parcels and conducted highway traffic stops and seized over 26 pounds of methamphetamine and thousands of fentanyl pills. Federal prosecutors also announced the indictment of a Nigerian national accused in a conspiracy to embezzle money from the Pura Wine Casino and Hotel in Pine Ridge. Kenneth Godwin faces wire fraud and cybercrime-related charges tied to allegations involving unauthorized access to protected computer systems. Meanwhile, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeal affirmed that a 30-year federal prison sentence for Eldwin Giovanni Salinas, an El Salvadorian national convicted of trafficking approximately 16 pounds of fentanyl. Authorities say Salinas transported nearly 50,000 fentanyl pills and cartel-linked fentanyl powder with an estimated street value of $2 million. A federal jury in Pierre acquitted 26-year-old Joey Kills Plenty of assaulting and firearm charges tied to allegations stemming from Rosebud Sussex Indian Reservation. In Nebraska, federal prosecutors say a Lincoln man tied to methamphetamine distribution network supplied by a Mexican source has been sentenced to more than 15 years in prison. 31-year-old Jaden Riemann received a sentence of 188 months after investigators uncovered drug transactions tied to counter systems operating across Omaha and Council Bluffs. Authorities seized approximately 174 grams of methamphetamine concealed in a water bottle during a traffic stop. Investigators say Riemann's cell phone contained extensive communication with narcotic suppliers. Federal prosecutors in Colorado announced a 16-year federal prison sentence for an Aurora man tied to a violent robbery spree across Denver metro area. 23-year-old Ira Hymans admitted to committing 12 armed robberies targeting convenience stores between January and February of 2024. Authorities say clerks were repeatedly threatened at gunpoint while cash and tobacco products were stolen. The FBI described the crime as a brazen act of violence that traumatized store employees throughout multiple counties. Federal prosecutors also announced a guilty plea from 19-year-old twin brothers Javon and Javarius McLean. Authorities say the brothers committed multiple armed robberies while already on state bond for earlier robbery charges. Investigators allege that the pair collectively committed approximately 20 armed robberies throughout Denver area. In Kansas, a Missouri man has been indicted on federal child exploitation charges after prosecutors say he traveled from Missouri to Kansas to engage in illicit sexual conduct with a minor. 43-year-old Joshua David Kolob faces charges including production of child sexual abuse material, coercion and enticement of a minor, and interstate communication involving threats. Federal prosecutors also announced a 10-year prison sentence for a Mexican national, Carlos Nabal Mercado, in what authorities described as a kidnapping for hire plot tied to narcotic debt collection. Investigators say Nabal Mercado wanted a victim tortured over a $30,000 drug debit and provided undercover agents with firearms, vehicles, and detailed instructions. Authorities arrested him during a staged kidnapping operation in rural Kansas. Four additional defendants received lengthy federal prison sentences in a violent kidnapping conspiracy where a 65-year-old was allegedly duct taped, blindfolded, and transported between multiple locations. Authorities say the victim held for approximately 10 hours while the vehicle and cash were stolen. Federal prosecutors also announced the indictment of a convicted sex offender, Jesse Williams Laws of Leavenworth, on charges involving possession of child sexual abuse material. In Oklahoma, federal prosecutors say Oklahoma City woman has been sentenced in a healthcare fraud scheme involving more than $1 million in false claims. 49-year-old Natasha Allen received 20 months in federal prison after authorities determined she fraudulently billed Blue Cross Blue Shield for behavioral health counseling sessions that never occurred. Investigators say Almond submitted approximately $1.4 million in claims and received nearly $1.1 million in reimbursements. Authorities also announced the sentencing of Brandon Lee Richards, who received 5 years in federal prison after using stolen identity and social security numbers to fraudulently obtain a vehicle. Meanwhile, convicted felon Kayante Blancon was sentenced to more than 13 years in prison, followed by multiple firearm incidents, including a shooting and an armed standoff in Oklahoma City police. And a federal jury convicted 25-year-old Kevin Keys of lying on a firearm purchase form and illegally possessing a gun while already under indictment. Federal authorities in Texas announced hundreds of immigration and border-related criminal cases connected to Operation Take Back America. The Southern District of Texas says nearly 240 defendants were charged during a single week in late April. Cases include illegally re-entering, human smuggling, and felony immigration relations involving individuals with prior felony convictions for violent crimes, narcotic trafficking, and sex offenses. Authorities also secured convictions involving a high-speed smuggling pursuit and human trafficking organization linked to deaths in extreme heat conditions. Federal prosecutors also announced charges against a Houston area loan officer accused in a multi-million-dollar bank fraud conspiracy involving falsified tax returns and fraudulent loan applications. Meanwhile, Christopher Knight Lopez was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison in connection with a $17 million Ponzi scheme that targeted more than 40 victims. Victims included retirees, business owners, and families invested retirement savings and college funds. Federal courts also hand down major narcotic trafficking and human smuggling sentences tied to cartel-linked operations moving cocaine through Laredo. Authorities seized more than 65 kilograms of cocaine valued at almost $1 million. Investors also announced the sentence of an admitted Posse's gang member, Julio Ivan Salago, who received 55 months in prison for human smuggling activities tied to repeat offenses. Federal prosecutors in Louisiana announced multiple immigration, narcotic, fraud, and child exploitation prosecutions. A Honduran national and Guatemalan national were sentenced in a separate illegal re-entry cases after authorities determined they had returned to the United States following deportation. Meanwhile, a federal grand jury convicted Leon Duncan, also known as Head Baby, in a methamphetamine and cocaine trafficking conspiracy tied to Muna Bang organization in Tab Box. Authorities say investigators seized multiple cellular phones containing narcotic-related communication. Federal prosecutors also announced the sentencing of Larry Turner of Tickfall, Louisiana, to 14 years in prison after investigators recovered more than 5 kilograms of fentanyl distinguished in a counterfeit pill form. Authorities additionally seized multiple firearms from Turner's residence. The FBI also announced charges against 3 men accused of traveling to Louisiana to engage in illicit sexual contact with individuals they believed to be minors. Federal authorities say the investigation involved undercover online operators targeting suspects' child predators. The defendant faces charges including coercion and enticement of a minor and traveling for illicit sexual conduct. Federal prosecutors additionally announced guilty pleas involving CARES Act fraud, tax fraud, and counterfeit currency operation. Authorities say Tillamook Parish residents Chelsea Powell fraudulently obtained pandemic relief funds through PPP loan applications, and New Orleans resident Amanda Kolinsky pled guilty in conspiracy to involving counterfeit $100 bills manufactured using genuine $1 bills. Federal prosecutors across the Great Plains and southern United States continue to pursue cases involving violent crimes, fentanyl trafficking, fraud, organization smuggling operations, child exploitation, firearm offenses, and financial corruption. Authorities say many of these investigations involve partnerships between local police departments, tribal agencies, federal task force, Homeland Security investigation, the FBI, DEA, Border Patrol, and the United States Attorney's Office nationwide. For continued coverage of federal investigations, criminal prosecutions, border security developments, and major public corruption cases, stay with Englebrook Independent News. I'm Haylee Ficuciello. Good night.